There is actually a lot of questions popping up in the chat here. Felix is asking what the motivation behind using lie detectors in border control is now, and I want to pick up on that as well. So, first of all, what's the motivation? But also, is that EU border police that is using these techniques, or is that independent private sector actors, Frontex, whosoever, who's focusing on technicizing border controls?
Great question. I mean, it's both, and it's everyone. There's definitely an appetite on part of all the different entities that are part of the kind of immigration, migration management ecosystem. Definitely Frontex, and we cover some of this in our report, and you might also want to check out the work of State Watch. They've been doing incredible work trying to track what Frontex is doing on part of, the kind of technological experimentation that they're engaged in. But I think the motivation, I mean, it's an interesting question because it really gets at also the kind of ethics and politics of research funding, because technically this was presented as a research project in partnership with a university in the UK. The name now escapes me, but there was a university that was involved in the development of the iBorder Control project, which is interesting too. And by interesting, I mean troubling. Similarly to perhaps the Stanford algorithm that I mentioned. Again, universities themselves are embedded in this knowledge production regime as well, and they're complicit as well. I think, given the fact that we are at a virtual university event, it's important to mention that as well, because the motivation sometimes comes from, oh well, this is just an interesting area for us to think about. This is an innovation for innovation's sake, as if that actually exists, somehow divorced from the power and politics of how this technology actually plays out in the real world. And about the motivation, I mean, this is definitely something I think about a lot, because it comes out in the conversations that I have, for example, with private sector actors who are either working with universities or with states on these types of solutions. And the pushback I often get is, well, I mean, we're just developing it. We're just thinking through it. This is just kind of a theoretical exercise for us. And it's not really our problem to figure out what our client is going to be doing with this, right? But I think that's a completely really difficult and problematic way of looking at it. And it's an obfuscation of responsibility on part of the tech sector and on part of the private sector that is deeply embedded in this kind of economy that has sprung up around border technology. And I think the iBorder Control project is a perfect example of that. And I think it's one of many. There'll be many, many more, and there are, of course, many others at the Horizon 2020 level and at the EU level as well. So this is just one example of, I think, how this is playing out.
Bettina switched her camera on. I think she wants to say something.
Okay, I do want to say something, but the reason I switched my camera on is that I feel it's so terribly lonely in these online rooms if all you see is the presenter and maybe the organizer. And I'm always experimenting with or trying to find ways in which it feels less awkward. And so I thought I'll just switch my camera on, even if it doesn't mean anything. But okay, because I talk a lot, I have a question. Can I ask with voice? No. Okay. But you should look at the chat as well. It's a bit of a complicated thing because I'm making this up while I speak. So you mentioned we have to get the voice of those actually impacted into the picture. That was your point too on one of the last slides. And I very much agree with that. And it's a thing that is being repeated very often in this whole tech criticism and AI ethics area. And it's absolutely true. But let's say there is historical precedent of stakeholders, vulnerable stakeholders being put into the decision processes and things just getting worse, and these people being put into impossible decision situations. And sorry, I'm talking in riddles. As a German, you go back to German history, And there were the so-called Jewish councils, who were basically Jewish leaders had to decide who's going to get deported and who isn't. And this was an extremely problematic and terrible situation for all involved. Hannah Arendt wrote a lot about that, got a lot of flack about that in her report on the Eichmann trial. And I think everybody is really agreed now that these people were put into some of the most horrible decision situations, are all under the guise of we're involving stakeholders, as we would say now. And I'm sure that especially human rights lawyers and lawyers in general have learned the lessons from these experiences historically, and have looked at how we can ensure that that by a well-intentioned, naive way of trying to involve stakeholders in decision making, we're not creating impossible situations that make things just worse. And I see a lot of danger of this naive, well-intentioned, we're just going to bring in stakeholders thing. So if you could elaborate on this question a little bit. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that intervention and for bringing up that historical perspective. I think it's very important to kind of problematize this blanket idea that now is sometimes thrown around as like, well, we'll just involve affected communities and that's all well and good. And unfortunately, what we also see in this space is this kind of tokenization of particular experiences and this kind of after the fact thinking around, well, oh, now we're doing this project on X, Y, and Z. Let's bring in affected communities as experts or whatever at some later point, when it actually, one way around this, and this is something that we are trying to experiment with at the Migration Technology Monitor, is really thinking critically about the methodologies that we use from the get-go. Not as an after the fact, not as, oh crap, I forgot to talk to someone, 3 months into my project, let me revise my questions on whatever. But it's actually about participant action research as a methodology. It's about involving people with lived experience from the very beginning in terms of setting out actually what are the issues that matter. It shouldn't be us deciding it these forums or in policy circles, but people, who are actually affected by this kind of technological development. And I don't just mean in migration, I mean, generally speaking. But definitely, and for me, again, as someone who's relatively new to the kind of digital rights tech critique space, I'm constantly quite taken aback by how kind of problematic it can be. And particularly, I would say actually at the EU level, where people now are kind of becoming aware maybe more of issues around systemic racism, racial justice, all of these issues as well, and thinking, okay, well, now we need to somehow talk about also diversity and all these ideas and doing it in a very surface level way without actually trying to understand the histories, the logics, the ways that we are all complicit in the way that our world works. And that's not going to be fixed by some sort of tokenization of particular experiences. With the Migration Technology Monitor, we are a lucky collective because many of us have experiences of migration and dislocation ourselves. Not that that makes us experts in anything other than our own lived experience, but we are trying to think of different ways to design knowledge production projects, design also the kind of redistribution of resources, because we don't want to be just another kind of entity, an institution that holds on to a lot of money from a foundation. We want to actually be able to redistribute some of this towards more kind of collectivist ways of thinking and doing things. That's why I was really lucky when I met Jan Tobias and his group in Brussels, because we, I think, get along very well when it comes to the kind of decentralization of certain ways of working together with community. But definitely, I mean, Bettina, I really take your point. I think this is something that we need to think about critically and carefully at every juncture in this space, because otherwise it just does become this kind of surface level exercise of, oh, well, now we'll just do a focus group at the end of our whatever project that we do, because I am seeing that time and time again, this kind of whiplash after the fact where people kind of have forgotten why they're actually doing the work in the first place.
Also, I just put a link in the chat. The latest book by Maurice Steele on migrant resistance in contemporary Europe. I happen to write a review on this book right now, and it really focuses on this particular aspect. I think it might be interesting literature for you. Okay, but we have plenty of questions in the chat. I think we need to go through some of them at least. So Olia from CIF is asking if it will be interesting to see what decisions are made in terms of challenging the outcomes of algorithms. Do we have any information on that already? Are there ongoing court cases from which we can enforce something?
Very good question. That's something that we're also trying to map out. As far as we know, there's been very, very few in the kind of migration and technology space. If you're interested, there was one last year at the UK level by a group called Foxglove. They were challenging the Home Office's visa algorithm and actually managed to successfully get the Home Office to rescind its plans before it actually even went to a full court hearing. But other than that, there's been a few other kind of algorithmic decision-making type cases that you might want to check out. There was the Siri welfare algorithm in the Netherlands. There was the Compass algorithm in the criminal justice sentencing side of things at the US level in Loomis and Wisconsin. That's the name of the case. If you're interested, I'm just going to put in the chat. But absolutely, I mean, this is such a new area. I think it's challenging all of us to see how we can potentially litigate some of this. And it is something that we are turning our minds to at the Monitor as well. This is more of a longer term project, but definitely strategic litigation is something that we are thinking about. Very, very early days. We're not exactly sure how this will look because, again, you just even from like the building up a case perspective, how does one actually do that when it's kind of a brand new territory? It's stumping all of us a little bit to think about what would be actually the right kind of forum, the right actor, what kind of evidence do you collect when a lot of the evidence is difficult to collect, right? Or it's proprietary, or you can't even get your hands on an algorithm. And even if you do, it's not like I can understand it, right? As a human rights lawyer, like to me, you know, I can't necessarily build a case around that, but we are definitely thinking about it. So I would say stay tuned. But here I put the name of this is the one, the Loomis in Wisconsin, that's the Compass algorithm in the States. And then you might also want to check out the stuff that's been happening in the Netherlands.
I'm trying to rephrase that question by Peter a little bit. So he mentions that automated decision making is relatively common in speeding up processes for highly skilled migrants in case of you know, hiring decisions and stuff like that. But when exactly did that switch to using automated decision management in asylum processes and in migration management start? Do we have an overview of, did that happen in the last 1 or 2 years, or was that already the case before?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't know if my answer will be satisfactory, but a lot of it is we just don't know. There is this kind of opacity and the slippage that happens between some of the ways that it's introduced at first. So, you know, something like Canada's doing, right? Like automated decision-making for visa triaging from India and China, like a very, very specific case example. But what happens then is we've been trying to track how states and governments use this point of intervention as a way to then justify and increasing experimentation into other areas. Now, I will say automating asylum procedures is kind of on the fringes. We're not seeing a lot of that yet, but unfortunately, the way that things are kind of moving, that's kind of the next frontier. And then even when we actually maybe need to problematize that too. When we say automating kind of refugee and asylum procedures, what do we mean by that, right? Do we mean someone appears in front of like an algorithm or an AI judge? No, I mean, but that's like the kind of most extreme example of this. And I don't think we're going to see any of that in the next foreseeable future. It's not like I don't think judges are going to relinquish the power that they have in court to an AI system anytime soon. But I mean, but there are definitely already ways that automation is making its way into it, right? Even with the data collection in refugee camps. And again, I think it has to do with the power and the ability of people to opt out. It's one thing for you and I to, for example, be faced with some sort of technological tool that would, I don't know, let's say like scan our irises at our grocery store, and we can say, well, no, thank you, I'm just going to go to another one. or I'm going to not download this app on my phone or whatever. But if you're in a refugee camp and you getting food is tied to you having your irises scanned, chances are you might not opt out even if you want to. And again, this is a real case example. We are seeing iris scans in a variety of different refugee camps now. So I think, again, I mean, maybe it's not necessarily about the most kind of egregious examples of appearing in front of a fully automated decision maker, but this kind of automation is already making its way into the way a person lives through and moves through their migration experience. And with the way that the trends are going in the next few years, I imagine that this is going to, accelerate.
There is another question by Felix, which points to the European Cloud Initiative, which has apparently huge impact by companies like Palantir. Do you have an opinion on that one?
So I don't know a whole lot about the European Cloud Initiative. I have an opinion on Palantir, that's for sure. I will look into the European Cloud Initiative. Thank you for drawing my attention to that. I mean, I can perhaps just make a quick jab at Palantir and other other private sector actors. They are embedded in a lot of again, the whole ecosystem of migration management, and because there's big money in this kind of way of understanding, the way that states and public entities are managing this. And definitely, I think if what I understand from your question, I mean, it's also about the influence of the private sector and the way that they're able to lobby for particular perspectives to count over others. We are seeing that time and time again with Palantir, but also with other lesser known private actors. And this is something a colleague of mine at Privacy International always reminds me of. Palantir is kind of the one that people now know and are critiquing, and rightly so. But there's this whole other economy of other actors that, are also equally, if not more problematic, particularly because they're able to hide perhaps under less notoriety. So we definitely need to be paying attention to that.
Would you want to comment something on the questions by Jenny, who's asking for challenging the initial input to algorithms, challenging explainability of algorithms? Do you think there will be legal requirements or standards on this, in specifically for the migration control asylum sector?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I'm just taking a look at your question here just to make sure I understand it. I mean, the explainability that's actually a really, really interesting point to all of this, because notoriously, refugee and asylum decisions are hard to explain, even when a human is making certain determinations. This is a common frustration with how immigration and refugee law has been codified and understood, and again, this is kind of what I was trying to get at. There's vast amounts of discretion that a decision maker already has when it comes to making decisions in this space. You can have the exact same set of evidence that goes in front of two immigration officers, and they make completely different determinations based on what? Oftentimes we don't know, even when they are compelled to provide reasons. This is a common problem in immigration and refugee law and decision making. So then when we start automating parts of it, how do we actually explain what is happening? And it's actually something that's really crucial and at the center of the kind of conversation that we need to be having, both through the kind of automation lens, because I think you're right, it definitely challenges the kind of, gamut of decision making that we can understand and critique, but it also gets at these broader questions. What are the rubrics that we are applying for trying to understand how a person, is making their case? Who gets to decide? How are we making these decisions? I mean, we barely understand human cognition and decision making, right? Particularly in this high risk discretionary space. But now that we're automating parts of it, it just becomes very muddied and confusing.
So the next question is interesting because it focuses on, I think, on your report and on your methodology there. You mentioned the importance of conducting research in an extractivist way. And can you say something about what that means for example, the way you do interviews with refugees and stuff like that?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a bit of a methodology fan. I know that's not the most sexy topic to talk about, but I think it's really important because it gets at the power dynamics that are inherent in the kind of knowledge production that we are all engaged in academia or quasi-academia, or even reports like this, right? And for me, I'm lucky because I kind of float between a few different disciplines, and when I'm trying to do some of this work, I think it's really important to slow things down and not work in this kind of frenetic way that lawyers in particular oftentimes work, which, don't get me wrong, and when you're litigating and when you're facing, for example, your client being deported tomorrow, there is something to be said about working quickly, efficiently, and getting things done. But when you're trying to understand, some of these more structural problems, this kind of the difficult, deep historical violence that's inherent in the way that borders have been created and continue to be created, slowing things down and working deeply and challenging kind of your own positionality in the way that you move through the world is really important. I try and do, and I think Jan Tobias saw some of this, it's more along perhaps, I guess, some of the more ethnographic, maybe anthropological methodologies where you spend time with people. You spend time in their space. You allow the people that you meet to, again, shape the way that you understand the issues, the questions you ask, or the questions you don't ask, because a lot of the information that you get actually comes from the silence and the space that you hold in those interactions. And I think, again, there's a lot to be said about building these deep connections over time. And, for our report, we would have loved for it to be much more deep and slow and long term. We were unfortunately impacted by the pandemic, by a variety of other factors, but we see this as a starting point. This is kind of just barely scratching the surface of anything. We really need to be able to follow up with people and also, again, embed them directly in the knowledge production of this type of stuff that we are talking about. We have enough lawyers and academics talking about this. I think we need to think of creative, different, decentralized methodologies for us to critique this through.
Yeah, that's also something that bothers me personally. So in this whole context of migration in Europe, what we usually see in the communities here is activists acting, being active, trying to help people, researchers, white researchers mostly being active, trying to interact with people, helping them, while we often see the migrants as a relatively passive mass who is just being shoved around and depends on our interactions, on our goodwill, on our intention to help them. Do you, when you work in camps or with these communities in Brussels or elsewhere, do you find a way to bridge that gap and like get at an equal level with them?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I mean, that again gets at the kind of deep power imbalance that's so inherent, I mean, in our world generally, but particularly in these spaces. And sometimes, yeah, I mean, civil society is kind of complicit as well, or migrant activists too, because there's this idea that, we are giving voice to the community that we work with. Well, first of all, no one's giving voice to anybody. We all have voices already. It's about creating spaces in which those experiences can be heard and engaged with in a meaningful, appropriate way. And, I mean, part of it sometimes is maybe comes from kind of a protective measure, which I think is justified. There's a lot of extractive work that gets done by researchers and lawyers who parachute into a community, do their little project, then they write their report, then they build their career on it, they get pats on the back, and they speak at the UN, and then it's like all good, right? We see that all the time. So I think rightly so, people need to be suspicious of the kind of knowledge production economy that has been built around migration. But I think, again, one way is to slow the work down, is to think about how do we actually design projects? Why are we picking particular areas? Who gets to determine what counts as a problem, right? Maybe I think privacy is super important, but actually the community that I'm meeting with doesn't care about privacy. Maybe they care about equality or freedom of expression or something else entirely. Collective rights, right? I think we need to, again, think about how we move through the world as the ones that are kind of maybe stitching this together or trying to find ways to talk about things, and not in an extractive way, but in a collectivist, community-oriented way.
Yep. Thank you. I think we've been going through all questions that have been posted in the chat, right? I'm wondering if I missed anyone, if anyone still wants to make an intervention here. No? Okay, then I think, yes, okay, good. No, there's still many people typing, so I'm wondering. Okay, cool. Good. So everyone is saying thank you. If you want to clap, we can clap again. So we get a bit of a clapping concert online.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for being here, Petra. And I'm looking forward to working more with you on the Migration Monitor or on the communities in Brussels or wherever. The next talk of this series is already on the 19th of January. And Brandon van Asseloy from the Data Protection Authority of the European Communion will speak about confidential communications and the use of technology to combat child sexual abuse. So we are staying a bit in the legal domain, and afterwards we're going to have more technical topics again. I think Bart Preneel will talk about Corona apps. Bettina, currently visible on screen, will talk about automated driving and automotive vehicles. Yeah.
I'll talk more about the ethical discussion around automotive vehicles.
Yes, exactly.
Thank
So
you.
you'll not be technical again. Well, at least we have Bart in between.
I will do my best to say where technological knowledge is very dearly needed. Okay? It's a borderline talk.
Okay, cool. So I hope to see many of you again on the 19th at 12:30. Here is the link to the next seminar. And if you want to, then just subscribe to the mailing list or check the website regularly to keep up to date on what we are doing. It's going to stay in the domain of technology and human rights and the interactions between law and science, which is probably interesting for our 3 research groups and for many external people. I'm really happy that we've been more than 50 people this time, and 37 of you stayed till the end. So thanks a lot for that, and I wish you a very nice start of the year. Thanks again to Petra, and I hope to see you soon.